When Monty, aka Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, said in 1943 there's only one thing to do, crash on to Tripoli, he couldn't have anticipated that 70 years later British forces would once again find themselves bombing the place. These British forces, together with their NATO allies and the Libyan rebels, have now surrounded the Libyan leader's compound. Now, regardless of if the colonel is ousted in the coming hours or days, many questions are being raised about NATO violations of the UN Security Council resolutions, questions also being raised about what the new era after Gaddafi's 42-year reign could bring to Libya, and questions are inevitably being asked about Islamists hijacking the revolution. To find out more, we're joined by two young commentators with a special interest in Libya. Journalist Nabila Ramdani specialises in Middle Eastern and North African affairs. Nabila has covered the conflict from Tripoli. She's interviewed both Colonel Gaddafi and his son, and Nabila's on the line from London, as is Shashank Joshi, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute Journal in the UK and a doctoral student at Harvard. Nabila, what's the latest you're hearing from Libya?
Well, the latest reports we're getting from Libya is that there are still pockets of resistance in Tripoli, and Gaddafi loyalists are still fighting rebel forces. The fighting seems to be escalating, with rebel forces now traveling from the east of the country, from Benghazi, armed groups joining in the battle in Tripoli, a city which has been invaded yesterday. Rebel forces managed to enter quite easily, in fact. It hasn't been won yet, and I think the biggest challenge will be to hold down a city like Tripoli, which is, of course, was the stronghold of the Gaddafi regime.
Now, The Guardian says that the Libyan rebels are advancing on Tripoli with the aid of NATO strikes. Quote, "This is sure to result in a real bloodbath. NATO is assisting rebels who are blocking food, water and medical supplies. NATO is bombing power stations, creating blackouts and using Apache helicopters to attack Libyan police checkpoints to clear roads for rebels to advance." Exaggerated comments, Nabila, or is that what you're hearing as well?
No, I'm afraid that's a reflection of what has been going on all along in this conflict. And it has to be said that the reason why the rebel forces were allowed to get so close to Tripoli and eventually enter Tripoli the way they did yesterday was precisely because NATO has been providing air cover but also air power. And it's not, a secret that NATO has made it its mission from the very beginning of this conflict to lead the rebels to outright victory by providing them with all sorts of financial support.
Nabila, how do you feel about this?
Well, I think, the UN Resolution 1973 was drafted in such broad terms and in such vague terms that, it had been interpreted, in a very broad manner. The countries involved in the conflict have been saying all along that the mission in Libya was about protecting civilian lives, but there was no doubt whatsoever from the beginning that the aim game was regime change, and that's what the NATO made sure to assist the rebels to achieve that.
Shashank, your reaction is what?
Well, I broadly concur. I think it's more than obvious that regime change was the objective very early on. I don't know if it was a case from the very beginning, but certainly almost very soon afterwards, after it became apparent that the rebels wouldn't be able to do this by themselves without significant support. Has NATO been providing support at that level? Absolutely, no doubt about it. France openly admitted to arming the rebels by airdropping arms in the west of the country. It's worth noting, I think, a small point, in that it's not just NATO, of course, it's also states like Qatar. Jordan has provided logistical assistance. Saudi Arabia has provided some low-key assistance. It's worth pointing that out because before this took place, there were many concerns about embroiling NATO in another war like this. Many of those concerns were legitimate and understandable. But one of the things that insulated Western foreign policy makers from some of these concerns was that they felt they had Arab states on side. Qatar is the most prominent, but it's not the only one.
Well, it certainly was a more plausible coalition of the willing than the invasion of Iraq. But, Nabila, we're talking about double standards, are we not? Because the international community has been very slow in reacting to the Syrian slaughter and yet dived straight into Libya.
Well, absolutely. I think that's one of the most striking aspects of the Arab Spring and the international community's response to events in Libya and Syria have been, quite different indeed. And it is shocking that to this day, for example, I'm saying there hasn't been a concerted, strategy from the international community to deal with the Syrian problem. I'm not necessarily saying that military intervention in Syria is, necessarily the answer to the problems in Syria at the moment. But, for example, an institution like the ICC, the International Criminal Court, was also prompt to serve arrest warrants on Gaddafi and members of his family. And, for example, in Syria, where there is ample evidence of, indiscriminate killing of not armed rebels, but of peaceful demonstrations, including children, women, and young men who have been killed, but also imprisoned and torture. The ICC is, for example, rather silent.
You're listening to LNL on Radio National, Radio Australia, and other global technologies, and we're discussing the latest developments in the Libyan conflict with guests journalist Nabila Ramdani and Shashank Joshi. We now know, Shashank, that the US alone have spent over $1 billion on the skirmish. I find it hard to think that they'll just pack up and go home. Do you anticipate a UN or perhaps even US military presence in Libya?
No, I don't. I think it's tempting to suggest that, but there really is no appetite for such a presence. Nor is Libya, by the way, particularly strategically significant. It's not like Syria in the heart of the Arab world. It's a large North African state, but with no particularly significant Western interest there. If oil isn't really a valid interest, because they were buying oil from Libya before the conflict itself. I think it's worth bearing in mind as well that $1 billion is really a drop in the ocean for US defense spending. So that sounds like a strange claim, but really it is a rounding error in the context of what the US spends on these issues.
Yes, perfectly true, Shashank. I cannot deny it. I like that. A rounding error. Okay, Nabila, what sort of groups make up the rebels? Because there's any number of ideologies, aren't there, in this smorgasbord?
Well, that has been one of the most pressing questions all along, really, and an awful lot of people have been trying to understand who the rebels are. And, I was covering the conflict myself, and I can say, for having been to Tripoli and travelled around Libya, that I have been, a part of the rebel forces, a very decent man, educated man, who, for all the right reasons, were challenging a very nasty regime. And for most of them, they were taking up arms for the very first time. Now, having said that, there were also, very nasty elements within the rebel groups, including members linked to Al-Qaeda, to the admission of the rebel forces themselves. And as we've seen, they were behind the killing of General Yunus, who was, of course, a Gaddafi commander who defected to join the rebel forces in the later stage of the conflict. So that's, a worrying element to bear in mind as the country will try to now, in my opinion, one of the immediate concerns in the post-Gaddafi era would be the management of security and policing in Libya.
Well, Shashank, we remember the catastrophic mistake the Americans made in Iraq when they decommissioned almost the entire Iraqi military and, opened the place up to chaos. What should happen in Libya? Should everyone who's ever supported Gaddafi, anyone who's ever worn his uniform or taken his penny, be denied a role in the future?
Well, if the rule of thumb was to punish those who had had any involvement with Colonel Gaddafi or served him in any capacity, the Transitional National Council would be forced to put most of its senior leadership in jail. And so I think, in an odd way, the fact that some of them have blood on their hands is an oddly positive thing. It means that they are unable to really back a full-scale campaign of retribution, nor do they seem particularly interested in it. And I believe them when they say that. I think they have genuinely good intentions and are being far-sighted. Now, of course, we don't know whether there are groups under their command, competing groups over which they have limited influence, that don't think in such benign terms. Of course, what should happen is a process of reasonable justice being done for those at the highest levels. Saif al-Islam is in custody now, and he will have a fair trial and will suffer a reasonable fate. But it would really cause a disintegration of political order if they pursued any sort of full-scale campaign along the lines of de-Baathification in Iraq.
Yeah.
Now, the problem is not with the army, because the regular army was so weak and had disintegrated anyway. The problem, I think, is more with the bureaucracy. But I have to make one important point, which is that the paradox of Libya is that the same factor that allows a power vacuum is the same thing that may allow them an opportunity for crafting their own political institutions and their own future, because there is no predatory military establishment that is looking over their shoulder at developments as is occurring in Egypt. And that may be a positive thing. It's also a very risky thing.
Yeah, now, Shashank, the Western world, of course, is in a slow-motion panic about the Islamists hijacking the revolution. You don't see that as a likely outcome?
Well, I think it's time for a fair degree of humility for us to accept we just don't know the nature of Islamist groups, particularly in eastern Libya. Of course, we know they're there. We know they're probably more prevalent than has been assumed or reported, and that's partly a conscious decision taken by rebels not to alarm their international backers. I think we also need to put it in context, and my own perspective on this is that although they are more prevalent than understood, they are also probably less politically influential than understood. And the comparisons that I've seen with the Taliban are nothing short of absurd. They are not the product of many decades of insurgency and state sponsorship. They have fought in Iraq and Afghanistan in many cases, but they really don't present anywhere near as severe a challenge as the Islamist groups on that scale.
Before I go back to Nabila, Shashank, what should the victors do about Gaddafi? What should they do with him?
Well, first of all, I'm sceptical that he can be captured alive. If he's in Algeria, that's going to be extremely destabilizing for Algeria's political order. If he is captured alive, I think he should face exactly the same fate as his son. That is, a process of fair trial, whether that's carried out by the ICC, because he now is, like his son, an indicted war criminal, or whether that's carried out by the Libyans themselves under a system of a fair court. I think that would satisfy legal demands, constitutional demands, moral demands, and it would also be a process of political catharsis for the Libyans. If they are allowed an opportunity to put Gaddafi on the dock, as the Egyptians have done to Mubarak, that would be an outcome that they could not have imagined, even perhaps a few weeks ago.
No, but let's put the complexities of ideology to one side and look at the tribal question. What can we expect from the long simmering tribal grievances, some of which must have been intensified by the war?
Well, absolutely. I think you're quite right to say that, in all these sort of situations, and especially when you have a conflict like the one we've seen in Libya, you get inevitably a build-up of grievances and a desire for revenge, but also you get a build-up of rivalries, even on the side of the people fighting Gaddafi. And for example, it seemed at first that the rebellion was coming from the east, from Benghazi, but more recently we've seen that the rebel forces from the southwest of Tripoli have become the major threat to the Gaddafi regime. And these people, and the people in Misrata, for example, don't seem to get on with the leadership in Benghazi. So we could see a rather difficult situation unfolding. And although Gaddafi's regime has been undone by a combination of NATO air power and rebels on the ground, the rebels on the ground might not agree on who should run Libya and if it should remain a single entity.
I'm concerned, Shashank, that there's a story of the regime possessing between 80 and a few hundred Scuds. Might this end in a sort of a ghastly self-immolation?
We can never rule out such a scenario. It's possible there are commanders in places like Sirte, which seems to be still under regime control, although we can't be sure, who have the ability to launch Scud missiles. And in an act of desperation, in an act of pure spite, they may well do so. But I'm skeptical this would actually occur in any way that presents a serious threat to the rebels or NATO or civilians. If Scuds are fired, they take an hour to fire their launch sequence because they are liquid-fueled, which always slows things down. And so NATO could probably spot these and destroy them. I've certainly heard from NATO sources that they aren't worried about these as a military threat. What is possible is the organization of an insurgency in places like Sirte or Sabha or even parts of Tripoli if military personnel have gone underground and may decide that the best revenge they can take on rebels is to militarily harass them through guerrilla warfare. I just find it difficult to imagine that's going to be a serious threat, simply because there's no ideological or ethnic or even really tribal basis on which to organize an insurgency.
Nabila, I know you've done a fair bit of work on the Scuds, haven't you? Do you share Shashank's views?
Well, I have indeed been looking at, the kind of weapons that Gaddafi had at his disposal at the beginning of the conflict, and he, what my findings were is that he, had, very archaic weapons, in fact, at his disposal, and the kind of weapons that if you do not use, on a regular basis, is no use to you over time, and especially over a long period of time. We're talking about weaponry that he acquired in the 1980s and the 1990s. He also had at his disposal, vast stocks of chemical weapons, and I would contend that if he was indeed thinking of using that kind of weapons, he would have done by now when, Tripoli was clearly under the threat of rebel forces backed up by NATO, as it were. And I think that moment has gone.
Of course, in Iraq, you had Saddam setting fire to his own oil wells. Is that a possibility, Shashank, that in a last stand there will be that sort of destruction by Gaddafi?
Well, we don't know how deep his reach penetrates into the state, whether he can really send forces to those areas where oil wells are located in Libya, the interior of the country. My inclination is to think that they are too far away. His forces are really preoccupied somewhere like Tripoli. If you look at the refineries, most of them are outside of his control. He could shell them, he could attack them with rockets, but it's not the same thing as setting wells to fire. So the degree of damage he can actually do diminishes with time, the more he's pushed with his back to the wall. If ultimately he is making his last stand in his compound, in a way that's not a bad scenario for the rebels. It is difficult to then smoke him out, but equally it contains the level of damage. And I think he's still going to be constrained in what he's really capable of, the havoc he's capable of wreaking.
Nabila, you've interviewed Gaddafis, father and son, including particularly the son who's been arrested. What were your observations of these characters?
Well, I think Gaddafi himself, has always played the role of he was a pariah on the international stage for many years. And I think, with the beginning of this conflict, the West has put him straight back in that position, in the position of the hard man defying the West, and he seemed to be quite comfortable to remain in that position. And we've heard, until, yesterday and even through his spokesperson today, defiant audio messages, formulated by Colonel Gaddafi. He's clearly not the type of a person to give up easily. That's, part and parcel of his character. And that's why he's been, so determined to remain in power all along. As far as his son is concerned, I've met Saif al-Islam Gaddafi on many occasions, and I wasn't able to interview him recently. And it has to be said that Saif Gaddafi was very much building up a profile in the UK as a reformer, as a technocrat. He was not a member of the regime, and he was, very much seen as the darling of the West until very recently. He was friends with, the former Prime Minister of this country, Tony Blair. He was mixing with royalty. And he was, I would contend, quite genuine about his reformist agenda. For example, he was quite instrumental in convincing his father to give up his weapons of mass destruction. He also set up on many occasions free media organization in his country, which his father kept shutting down. He freed alleged terrorists in Libya. But of course, when the real test to implement democratic ideals in his country came, he chose to side with men of violence and stick to the Gaddafi clan, and that was a rather unfortunate decision.
I've got to thank you both, Nabila Ramdani and Shashank Joshi. Nabila, of course, a journalist, and Shashank, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, LNL, on Radio National, Radio Australia, etc. Coming up, a campaigner against the stoning of women.